Hey gamers, it's time for an ad break. First, I want to mention that I myself have a Patreon now, so if you want to keep this show going and growing, consider helping me out at patreon.com/beyondsolitaire. Second, as usual, I'm very proud to say Beyond Solitaire is sponsored by the Center for Learning Through Games and Simulations at Central Michigan University. Their first published game, Monumental Consequence, has cleared customs and should be shipping out soon. If you didn't back it, you can still pre-order it through their Kickstarter page. Next, be on the lookout for their next project, Rising Waters, a game about the Mississippi Flood of 1927. You should also look into the Center's Certificate in Applied Game Design. They are offering amazing classes that you should absolutely sign up for. Starting on October 11th, game artist Lamaro Smith will teach a class about visual storytelling, and registration is open. Anyway, thanks so much for listening, and let's get on with the show. Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and today on the pod I have a very special guest. It is Ray Kimball. He is the founder and CEO of 42 Educational Games Coaching and Design. How are you doing today, Ray?
Liz, I am doing fantastic. Thanks for having me, and great to see you again after a terrific game development conference last week.
Yeah, this will be airing several weeks later, but yeah, Ray and I actually got to meet in person. We'd already planned to record an interview, but we also happened to meet at the Reacting to the Past game development conference. We got to play some history role-playing games and just be weird. It was great.
It was fantastic.
So you've got a long history with classroom games. Actually, before you started your company, I know that you were using games in your classroom at West Point. So I want to hear about that first. I'm very, very curious about this.
Yeah, absolutely. I had the good fortune of serving as a commissioned officer in the United States Army for 26 years and played a bunch of different roles in that capacity. I was a helicopter pilot. I was a strategist, but I was also a faculty member at West Point for a total of 10 years, getting to teach in the Department of History there and also doing some administrative service. And one of the things that I loved about teaching in the history department was, even though I was teaching what we call our core courses, which are part of the mandatory curriculum that all the cadets have to take, specifically, I was teaching the first year Western Civilization survey and then later the first year Russian history survey. Even though I was teaching a core course, a mandated course, I had enormous flexibility to innovate and try new things in my classroom. And one of the things that I seized on very quickly that I just saw an incredible response from cadets on was classroom games. And once my first kind of improvisational classroom game hit and took off well with them, I said, you know what, this is what I'm going to push from this point forward. This is fantastic.
So I saw you at a Reacting to the Past game. That's a specific type of classroom game that exists. Yep. But it sounds like you did your first one on your own. So like, what types of games have made it into your classroom over the years? And how many of them are ones that you developed yourself? How many did you get from other sources? How's that working?
Yeah, so primarily the ones that I've used have been role-playing games. I really find I love the space that role-playing games inhabits for a couple of reasons. One, they generally are not as resource intensive as tabletop games, stuff like that. I also find that role-playing games tend to be easier to get a group of folks up to speed on very quickly. You don't have to spend a lot of time talking about kind of rule mechanics on the board, and this piece means this, and this card means that. And that's not in any way meant to disparage the use of tabletop games for learning. I have colleagues who, one colleague who uses a World War I tabletop game and does amazing things with it. But for what I was teaching, I found that role-playing games just were a better fit for that first year population that I was teaching. A lot of the role-playing games that I did, I made up specifically to meet the needs of our curriculum. We teach, the survey courses that we teach are very broad, so you don't necessarily have the luxury to spend 2, 3, 4 class sessions on a game. It has to be very focused and straightforward and to the point. So the first one I actually ever came up with was when we were doing our unit on Greek philosophers. And the lesson is really intended to get cadets to understand Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, Stoics, folks who all inhabited that time frame, and understand how the questions that they were grappling with were representative of larger issues in Greek society at that point. And I was trying to think of how to present this in a way that just wouldn't be like lethally dull and boring. Of this is Plato, and this is what Plato said, and this is Socrates, and it just in my mind's eye I could see cadets just falling asleep at their desks if I did it that way. At the time, my son was about 4 years old, and he was getting ready to start preschool, and so the education of my son was on my mind, and so I came up with this idea of, what if the cadets had to pitch me on their school of Greek philosophy as a way of educating my son, right? So that was the pitch to them. Hey, you're going to inhabit a school of Greek philosophy. And I divided them up into small groups and assigned each of them to a particular school. And I said, look, not only do you have to convince me of your school of philosophy's applicability for my son, but you also need to undermine the other folks, right? So it's not enough just to make a case for me. You also need to tell me why the other folks that are presenting are, destructive and dangerous. And it went better than I could have possibly imagined. I thought I was going to get, maybe 20 or 25 minutes of dialogue what was at the time a 55-minute class. It's now a 75-minute class because of the way we've restructured our schedule. They went the distance and then some, right? They were still under steam, wanted to keep going, and I finally had to say, wait, okay, time out. We got a couple other things we got to discuss. So I'm going to stop the discussion and render a judgment. And so from that point forward, I said, there's something here. I'm really going to run with it. The other kind of game that I've used that I've really enjoyed is matrix games, right? Which is kind of a variant on role-playing games. For folks who aren't familiar, matrix games are usually played out on a map or on a board or something like that, but some kind of visual representation with tokens that shows where different factions are and what kind of actions they're doing. And the matrix game that I came up with, actually inspired by a matrix game that I saw at the Army War College as part of my professional military education. The matrix game I came up with was the Mongol invasion of Russia in the 13th century. And so one faction is playing the Mongols. Other factions then are playing different Russian or Rus is really the proper term at this point, other Rus cities. So Novgorod, Kiev, Moscow, and they are reacting to this invasion. There's also another faction that is playing the Orthodox Church and how the Orthodox Church is responding to this invasion. And again, the great thing about it's, role playing is getting people to inhabit. The thing that I loved about matrix games was that as part of a matrix game, when you propose a move, you have to justify that move, right? You have to say, I'm sending an emissary to the Mongols to get them on my side, and here's why I think it will succeed, because I'm a big trade partner, and Mongols want to trade, and they don't I'm not a threat to them. And then everybody else, as you go around the board, has to either agree with you and say why, or disagree with you and say why. So again, it gets students into that adversarial without being a jerk, right? It gets them into that space of critiquing in a professional manner, which people don't always learn in high school. And so, not disparaging high school, I'm just saying there's a lot of things that are contending for, high school space. And given the kind of the contemporary environment that people see dialogue being role modeled or not role modeled, as the case may be, it can be really hard for people to learn that skill of critiquing professionally. And so I love the Matrix game for that, for the critiquing that it engenders. So yeah, role-playing games and then one Matrix game have really been what I've used in my classroom.
Oh, that's super interesting. So your cadets seem to have taken to it right away. What about the people who were sort of in admin and observing? Was there any resistance to introducing games to your classroom as something frivolous, or did everybody just go with it pretty easily?
So I think there were really two things that worked in my favor in that respect. There was no resistance. This was seen as, wow, this is really cool, Ray. Tell us more. And I think I really had two things working for me in my favor. The first is that there is a long tradition at West Point, especially in the Department of History, but across all of the academic departments, of when you teach in the core curriculum, yes, the readings are standardized across all the sections in that course. The assignments are standardized, but how you run your classroom, how you spend that 55 or 75 minutes getting your cadets to understand those concepts is all yours. Right. And that may surprise people to hear that about a military academy, right? The stereotype that people would think is everybody has a standard deck and everybody is, teaching X, Y, Z, 1, 2, 3. And that's just not the case. There is a long tradition of letting instructors innovate in their sections and really seeing what works. So I had that going for me. I also really had the fact that culturally in the US Army, there is a great tradition of wargaming and of simulation being used to help people come to terms with difficult topics, to help people get better in their particular roles. And so when there were, when people would look at this and go, I don't know about this, I'd say, well, does it help if you think about it as a simulation instead of a game? That we're doing a simulation of the Russian Imperial Court, or we're doing a simulation of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then they would go, oh yeah, okay, that's cool. That sounds great. I want to go sit in on that. So there was definitely a cultural aspect that I could leverage to my benefit as well.
What's also interesting about you saying, oh, it's not necessarily a game, it's a simulation. It's very Nintendo. It's not a robot, it's a toy. But it also makes me think, your first one that you stumbled on, I think it goes to show that just because it doesn't have a whole lot of complicated rules, that doesn't mean that it isn't a game. And I think maybe role playing is perfect in that sense, because you can get somebody to step into a role just for funsies without it having to be like a Dungeons and Dragons, like, roll for initiative and you got to make sure your stats are good. And like, what's your armor right now?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think getting folks into that basic frame of mind. And again, this was it was either lesson 4 or lesson 5 out of a 40 lesson course. We typically met 2 or 3. So not only were these cadets brand new to the course, this was also the first semester of their first year. They were brand new to West Point, brand new to the Army. They were still kind of shaking off the culture shock of that first summer where we bring them in, right? Basic training is a firm break from what you were before, whether you were in high school, whether you were elsewhere in college. It's designed to be a very firm break and get you into the culture at West Point. And so the fact that they were, dealing with that shock, but still willing to kind of embrace this new identity, really, for one, I think speaks volumes about them and the quality of cadets we bring in, but I think also speaks to how accessible role-playing games can be as long as you're really, really willing to focus on lowering those barriers to entry.
So speaking of lowering barriers to entry, I guess actually I have several questions along these lines, but first, how complex do you think a game could be in a classroom before you start getting diminishing returns? Because I've thought about this as a teacher who loves games. You got to teach the subject matter before you teach a game. So about how far have you been able to push it in the past?
I think a lot of it has to do with how much prep time and debrief time is required to successfully execute the game. My kind of rule of thumb is that half the time for a game should be spent actually playing the game, and 1/4 to 1/3 should be spent debriefing. To me, the debrief is just as important as the gameplay, right? Mm-hmm. Because while you're playing, you can be so narrowly focused on your part of the game, right? Your world, what you're experiencing, that you may not even understand what other people are experiencing. And you may be like, well, that guy's being a jerk. Why is he being a jerk? What did I ever do to him? What did I ever do to her? And so getting that debriefing out where people can say, here's why I did what I did. Here's what I was perceiving, and getting other people to go, oh, got it. That's why. And then, of course, then you have to have kind of the remaining time, the 1/4 for prep. So I think so a teacher has to really assess how much time do I have available, and when that prep time can't be accommodated with that balance of play, with that balance of debrief. When it can't be accommodated, that's when I think teachers start running into problems, right? Because you have this great vision for, oh, I'm going to do this wonderfully complex game, and then you realize you've lost half your teaching time to just setting it up, and now you panic, right? Now you're like, oh God, what am I going to do? How am I? So you really have to be honest with yourself about, all right, how much time do I need to properly set this up? And if it exceeds what I'm willing to give it, okay, let's find some ways to scale down the complexity with the understanding that maybe I won't get to this fourth or fifth concept that I really wanted to hit on. Instead, I'm just going to have to be content with these 2 or 3. So one of my bosses used to call it taking an appetite suppressant, right? That you want to eat, you want to eat all this great stuff, but sometimes you got to take that appetite suppressant and go, okay, I'm going to limit myself. I'm going to be focused on what I want this game to achieve.
So we've talked a bit about kind of having to meet your students where they are and like in the reality of your classroom, but how do you get more reticent or introverted students to come and meet you? Like, this is something we talked about some at Reacting over the weekend as well. Not everybody is a ham who wants to role play and like goof around and really play things up. So how do you make sure that everybody feels invited to the table in kind of a setting that I think privileges people who are very unafraid of public speaking?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's no question that military culture as a whole is a dream come true for extroverts, right? Military culture really prizes extroversion. I am very much an introvert at heart, and I like to say that the Army taught me to be an extrovert on demand, right? That I learned when those times were that I just really needed to turn it on and be there and be outgoing and be engaged, but then also recognize that meant that somewhere down the line, I was going to need to pull back a little bit and kind of recoup for myself. So yeah, definitely games as a whole and military culture specifically prizes and prioritizes extroversion. What I found was most helpful was if it was a game that was individual roles, to make sure that I had roles that didn't necessarily require somebody to be out there like publicly advocating, but instead we're working behind the scenes, right? So whispering, the court advisor whispering in people's ear. There's a couple roles in my Catherine Russian Imperial Court game where people don't necessarily have to speak publicly at all. They're just whispering in Tsar Paul's ear of, are you really comfortable with this? Do you really, want to let this happen? And so for roles that have individual games, I think that's super important. Another great way to do that is if people can produce art of some kind, right? Visual art, poetry, song, whatever the case may be, looking for those people with those different abilities and different ways to present themselves. For games that run more kind of on a faction basis, that are more kind of group games, I think those are great for people who are less conventionally extroverted because they can be part of the team, they can be part of the group, but they don't necessarily have to be the guy or gal who stands up and gives the position of the group. So I think there are lots of ways to accommodate folks like that, and it is absolutely critical. You're right. It is absolutely critical that game designers are deliberate about that.
So because we've spoken before Reacting in the past, like I met you through somebody that does Reacting, but I actually did not expect us both to end up at that particular con. How did you get hooked up with Reacting to the past? Is that something that you were using before you moved on to your next career, or is it something that you've kind of discovered as part of 42 educational games?
Yeah, so it was not part of my teaching at West Point because most Reacting games, what we call flagship Reacting games, are longer, right? They typically require 4, 5, 6 sessions, maybe even as many as 10 sessions. And for the courses I was teaching, that was not a good fit. I stumbled on Reacting in my doctoral program when I was getting my EDD in learning technologies. I was going to the Games Learning and Society conference, which at that time was still at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And somebody, and I'm ashamed to admit that to this day, I don't remember who it was because I would love to like go seek that person out and thank them. Somebody was running a Reacting micro game, a single session game there that was a variant of the Athens game, which is one of the better known ones, Threshold of Democracy. And I was blown away. because I was like, not only is this a great match with what I'm already doing, but oh my God, you mean there's a whole publishing arm and there's an organization behind it? Are you kidding me? And so that started my association with Racting. I've been an advocate for it ever since. I was actually successful in kind of bringing it to West Point and getting it incorporated in the current version of the European History Survey course, which I don't teach, but I have some wonderful colleagues who do. And they now use the French Revolution game as part of that course, and it's super exciting, and I'm super happy to see it. And then the other thing that I've done with Reacting is I've worked as what's called a development editor, which is where I sit down with authors who are developing, they're building Reacting games, and just need a little extra push, right? I think for folks who are higher ed faculty or high school faculty, I think everybody can empathize with the idea of, I have this great idea for a game and I have stuff and it's kind of halfway there, and then life is intruding. And I don't have time, I don't have the bandwidth, I can't push it any farther. I've had the great pleasure as the development editor to work now on 6 different games to kind of push them forward at various stages of development, and see them and put them back in the author's hands and let the author run with them, and see them continue to move along the publication process. That has both been immensely gratifying for me in kind of giving back to the Reacting community. And it has also been great for me as an educator to see all these different games, their different game mechanics, the different ways of presenting complex ideas. It has really been a great growth opportunity for me to get that perspective and say, oh, wow, yeah, that's a great way to present that. I'm totally going to keep that in mind for later games or later teaching.
So before we move on to your company, I also just want to ask, so you taught at West Point, but you also went there like as a cadet yourself. And I was wondering, was gaming part of the culture at West Point when you were there? Did something change between when you were a student, when you were a teacher? How has gaming culture evolved at an elite military academy? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, so certainly wargaming was a big part of the culture when I was there. You know, there were simulations, there were live training events, things like that. And then there was also a wargaming club that did kind of the classical miniatures, wargaming, as well as some of like the old Avalon Hill games, if you're familiar with some of those. And you know, when you say wargaming, kind of what comes to mind is, oh, we're taking this battle and we're fighting it out. We're seeing how that goes. And then there were also a lot of, I had a friend circle that did role-playing games, primarily Dungeons and Dragons. That was a nice kind of distraction. There really was not a lot in the way of classroom gaming that I remember. It just wasn't something that was prevalent. Fast forward, and that was kind of the 1991 to 1995 was the time frame that I was a cadet there. Fast forward 10 years to 2005, when I was a faculty member, when I started my first tour as a faculty member, and I started to see some elements of it coming in. Obviously, I had my own work, and then I was also seeing other folks, especially in the social sciences, who were also starting to use role playing. And I think that, candidly, I think the big difference was the internet. Right? That West Point it's a beautiful campus, but it's immensely isolating. You are literally on a rock cliff top above the Hudson River. It looks like Hogwarts. Honestly, if you're coming up the Hudson River and you're looking at it, you see it on the left, and it looks like the Harry Potter shots of you're coming up on Hogwarts. That's what it looks like. And in a pre-internet era, so 91 to 95. The World Wide Web, we had email, but we were still getting a sense of what it was all about. The World Wide Web was just getting its legs underneath it. And so, West Point was a tremendously isolated place at that time. Fast forward 10 years later, and we're starting to see mobile devices where, internet is everywhere. All of the classrooms are wired for wireless internet. And I think that made a huge difference for the faculty there in letting them experiment and bring in other ideas. I know for me, the ability to do very quick research on the internet, quick scholarly research on the internet to reinforce some of what I wanted to do in classes was a game changer. I would not have been able to write the micro games that I did on the time frame that I did, which was usually like 1 or 2 weeks before class. Without the benefit of internet resources, there's no way I would have been able to do it on that timeline.
That's super interesting. So you have now moved on to kind of go into business for yourself. So you went to West Point, you taught at West Point, you've had this illustrious career, and now you're like kind of in career phase 2. Yeah. And so tell us about your gaming company.
Yeah, so this tends to be very common for military officers because of the military folks in general, because of what we call the up or out phenomenon, that you can only serve so many years at a given rank, and then if you're not promoted to the next rank, that you have to retire, you have to move on. And it's a way of keeping kind of youth and vigor in the force, if you will. And so as I was coming up on that point, and I felt very strongly that I had achieved everything that I wanted to as an Army officer. I was content with what I had done. I had, loved the service that I was doing at West Point, the work that I was doing there. But I felt like I had achieved what I wanted to do. There were some newer people that were coming up through the pipeline that I knew were well positioned to take things that I had done and really elevate them, take them to the next level. So I was like, okay, it's really at about my 24-year mark, I said, all right, it's time to move on. And what do I want to do next? And when I looked at what really kind of sparked the most joy, to use Marie Kondo's phrase, when I looked at what sparked the most joy for me, yes, I love teaching. Yes, I love working with cadets. But what really sparked the most joy for me was working with faculty to put new and innovative ideas in their classroom, right? To experiment with new things. My last job at West Point, I was the chief of faculty development. And so I got to have my fingers in a lot of different pies on different aspects of faculty development, whether it was teaching, whether it was service, scholarship, all cadet and faculty development, all of those things I got to play with. And I got such a charge from doing that. So I kind of sat back and I said, well, I love helping faculty and I love classroom games. Is there something there? And I kind of looked at the market and you looked at what people were offering. And I said, well, there's a lot of educational game designers out there that are doing great things. And there's a lot of faculty developers out there that are doing great things. Okay, got it. But I didn't see anyone who was really consciously trying to be that bridge of, hey, faculty member, let me help you bring a game into your classroom. Because as we mentioned, there can be enormous barriers, right? The perception barrier of, oh, this isn't really serious, this isn't really rigorous. The fear barrier of, what if I try this and it crashes and burns? Am I going to look like an idiot? Am I going to look stupid? What if a student, goes some crazy direction with it and somebody else films it and, oh my God, now I'm on TikTok and what next? There are a lot of barriers to adoption of classroom games. And so I said, I think there's something there. I think there's something to be said for a company that is there for faculty members who want to try out game-based learning but have no clue where to start, for them to have somebody to help them find an existing game and tweak that existing game in a way that makes it a perfect match for them, right? So they don't have to spend that valuable time, their valuable time, which is so limited, right? And so constrained with so many other things, that they can just take that game and run with it and integrate into their classroom. And so I said, hey, I'm gonna try this out. I was very deliberate about the choice of terms. So 42, for your audience, if there's any Douglas Adams fans out there, that is a Douglas Adams reference. For those not familiar with it, in the Douglas Adams Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series, 42 is legendarily the answer to life, the universe, and everything. And of course, part of the gag is what kind of question gives you that answer, and there's a whole thing on that. So 42 was really meant to signal that I was open to really just about anything, right? That math, social sciences, humanities, I don't care what your background is, let me find a thing that works for you. Educational, of course, explains itself. And then for coaching, I was very deliberate. People ask me this all the time. They're like, aren't you really a consultant? And for me, in the educational context, consultants really kind of have a bad reputation in the educational context. One of my colleagues described it perfectly in that a consultant is like a seagull. They fly in, they make a lot of noise, they poop all over everything, and then they fly out again. And I didn't want to be that seagull, right? I didn't want to be that guy who comes in, says, "Oh, here's a great game for you, have fun," and then runs away again. So I very deliberately picked the idea of coaching as, hey, I'm a coach. I'm going to help you with this. We're going to look at what your specific needs are, and we're going to focus on those needs rather than me trying to force you into whatever my cookie cutter view of the world was. And design, because of course I see the possibility that some folks may want to do custom games and custom game design, but I do think that for a lot of educators, really their needs can be met with one of the many educational games that are already out there on the market that are just looking for an audience.
So I actually want to ask about that. How is there, I mean, I feel like educational gaming is becoming hotter, but I actually can't name a whole lot of brands or like lines of educational games, if that makes sense. Is there just like a whole ocean out there and we just don't know? Or is it like a growing thing the last few years? What is out there actually?
Yeah, I mean, so there are lots of different options. You know, one that immediately comes to mind in kind of the digital space is Filament Games, that's based out of Wisconsin, that, you know, has a long history of digital games. Of course, reacting to the past in terms of role playing has a great area there. And then in terms of tabletop games, there are lots of tabletop games out there that are based in reality, that use real world mechanisms, and that are really easily adaptable to that. It's a little harder to name kind of a specific designer or a specific individual in that space, although I know the Center for Learning and Game Simulations out of Central Michigan has Rising Waters coming out soon, which is this amazing board game that talks about racial disparities and how that plays out in floodplain areas and flood-stricken areas. And I think you've talked about that elsewhere on your podcast. I think you've already had Scout on.
There is literally an ad break at the start of this episode that probably mentions games.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah.
So from what I'm understanding then is that it's not necessarily like, oh, they're educational game. Like, you know, I want a textbook. I'm going to go see if Pearson's published anything. It's not so much that. It's more that gaming is such a rich hobby that if you know where to look, you can find something that's going to apply to you and to your needs, maybe just with some tweaking.
I think that's absolutely right. Yes. And I'll even go one step further, that gaming is becoming so prevalent now and so ubiquitous in our society that, you know, whereas even 10 or 15 years ago, there might have been some hesitation on the part of students of, oh, this is lame, why are we doing this? Now they just kind of accept games as, oh yeah, this is what we do. And games that you wouldn't even necessarily think of as educational, with, you know, the air quotes around them, can absolutely be turned to educational purposes. The great example of this, my colleague Morton Ender, who teaches sociology at West Point, has a version of Monopoly that plays out socioeconomic strata. And it's absolutely brilliant because it uses just a straight Monopoly board and pieces, right? Nothing special, you know, you probably have one buried in the house somewhere that was put away after somebody threw a tantrum the last time you played it, because we all know that's what happens when you play Monopoly. And so just standard Monopoly board, but each of the players inhabits a different socioeconomic status, which means that they experience the game differently. Higher SESs get more money when they pass go. They spend less time in jail, if they spend any time in jail at all. They can buy some properties that are redlined from lower SES. And he's done an amazing job of structuring this game in a way that is supported by empirical research, right? In the packet that he's put together, he's got the academic literature that says, look, this is actually happening to people. This is people's lived experience. And it's a really great way of illustrating that to students of inhabiting those different perspectives and going, oh, I get it now. I get it, how people feel like they have no path forward, how they feel like there's no route to advancement. because of these structural barriers that are in place. So I think that's a great example of a game that you wouldn't even necessarily think as educational, but once you understand what your learning objectives are, can be put to that end fairly readily.
That's really interesting. I also think that thinking back to your first game, something like reacting to the past that's like a little bit more interpersonal and just like fun for that reason. I mean, one thing that I remember in school is that when we did get to play a game and it was an educational game, I actually never remember liking those at all. So like, how do you when somebody says I want a game, do they usually want what you think they want? Do you have to like communicate about it? And then how do you like give somebody the thing that matches learning objectives but it's also like fun?
Yeah, well, and that's the key, right? There used to be a saying in game studies of chocolate covered broccoli. And there was the idea that you wanted them to eat their broccoli, so you put some chocolate on top of it and that'll get them to eat it. And the metaphor was, oh, we'll put this kind of slick game interface on something and get them to eat. And so this was like classically the idea behind like Math Blaster and stuff like that. Well, the reality is chocolate covered broccoli is disgusting. Okay. I'm just going to come out and say it's disgusting. It ruins two perfectly good things, chocolate and broccoli. So to the question of then, okay, so how do we find a game that works for somebody? To me, there's really two things that have to be assessed up front, and they're both equally important. The first is the classroom context, right? So not only what are their learning objectives, of course, that's paramount, that's critical, but what does the learning population look like? Who are these people that are in your classroom? Are they, first year college students? Are they continuing education adults? Are they special needs high school students, right? All of these populations have very different needs and very different requirements. What does the physical layout of your classroom look like, right? Are you teaching in a space that has kind of hard fixed desks that you can't really move around, or do you have a little more flexibility in that regard? So you've got to understand that classroom context first, but equally as important is the institutional context. We all understand that institutions have different levels of risk tolerance. That is just a reality of an institution, whether you're talking about West Point or whether you're talking about a high school. Different institutions have different levels of risk tolerance, and you have to understand what that level of tolerance is and what they will and will not tolerate. So for instance, some institutions are fine with the idea of a tabletop game, right? Oh, sure, little pieces moving around, no problem, but are scared about the idea of a role-playing game because, that you lose control, and what if somebody says or does something that is off color, and how do you recover from that? There are other institutions that are fine with the idea of a role-playing game, but don't have the infrastructure to support a digital game, right? Not all of the students have the same digital platform, or some do, some don't. And so you've got to understand those two first, the classroom context and the institutional context. And that then empowers you to go out and find a game that works well in those. And I can't emphasize this enough. You're almost never going to find the perfect game that is the perfect match. Because if you could do that, you wouldn't need me, right? You could just go Google it and find it on your own. Instead, typically what has to happen is you look at the game and go, okay, yeah, that's pretty close, but it needs this rule tweak, or it needs this syllabus insert to help somebody understand this particularly complicated part of the game, or it just needs a video explainer talking somebody through it. And that's the second piece that I really pride myself on bringing in, is putting in that tweak, putting in those extra elements so that I can then turn around and hand that to that faculty member and say, here you go, it's ready. You can turn around and use this in your classroom tomorrow if you want to. You don't have to spend any more mental labor or any of your hard time on getting this on getting this game ready to go for your classroom. I want to see you turn it loose and do great things. And so I think it's really all about that process of understanding the context, finding the game that's close enough, and then making those tweaks to get it from close enough to, hey, this is perfect. This is what they really need.
Nice. So that leads to further questions. So, okay, I know this as a teacher. I get really excited about some lesson that I put together, or, maybe a game that I want to play, and maybe the kids just aren't feeling it. Maybe I'm not feeling it. Something just goes wrong, and how do you, when you're trying out classroom games, what is your advice to somebody who tries one and it just falls flat? How do you handle that? Especially because I think there's a greater feeling of risk or embarrassment
Mhm.
associated with playing something like a classroom game as opposed to just giving a normal lesson. How do you work through that?
So the first thing I would tell them is, congratulations, you have now joined an esteemed fraternity of educators that have had games flop on them. Okay, congratulations, you are now part of this club, because it has happened. I don't like categorical statements, but I'm gonna make a categorical here. Any educator who has tried games in the classroom has had some aspect of a game go bad on them. Maybe not the whole game crash and burn, but some piece they just went, oh my goodness, that did not work the way I wanted. So first off, congratulations, you're part of an esteemed group. You can, add that as a badge. The second thing I would say is, okay, what a great opportunity now to learn from your students, right? To have that conversation and say, all right, this didn't go well. Let's talk about why it didn't go well, because why you think as an educator it didn't go well may not be what your students thought. And it may be something as simple as a misunderstanding, right? That a particular term you used means one thing to you and means something very different to them. So what a great opportunity then to learn. And coming out of that, what a great opportunity to role model for your students being a scholar and being an educator, that part of that is failure, that educators and scholars don't always get it right. They don't always, have all the answers. And what a great thing to role model for your students, because a lot of times students are like, I don't have all the answers and I'm terrified because if I do one thing wrong, I'm totally hosed. Well, congratulations. You've just role modeled for them that something that you planned went wrong, and hey, look at that. The world's still rotating. The floor of my classroom didn't split open into a chasm and swallow me. We're going to be able to continue to move forward. So those are the things that I would really say is happens to everybody. Great opportunity to engage your students and great opportunity to really role model great teaching and learning practice.
I guess this is the other question I have about classroom games too, is also, but I've often wished my classroom floor would open a chasm and swallow me. But it's funny, like my students think that I'm so old and uncool. And I'm like in my mid-30s and I'm like, what? I'm young.
Yeah, I gave up. I used to try and use pop culture references in my class all the time, and I had to give up because every time I'd throw out a reference there that I thought was really funny, and I just got the blank stares of, what are you talking about, old man? And I just like, okay, I can't do this anymore.
I just use their references to embarrass them. Like I'll just use whatever language is cool right now, and they get so upset. And yeah. I will especially make sure to make it sound stilted and awkward. And then Absolutely. They get mad. It's hilarious. But that's the game I like to play in my classroom. How much can I embarrass these children today? But the other thing I think is interesting, we were at a playtest conference together. And so playtesting is interesting because when something goes wrong, it's, what is it? Is it something that is a small tweak? Is it something that is a big fix? How, and I think in a classroom, that's a much more unforgiving environment to try things in, because you can't make your students play the same game again and again and again. They don't care, and you have to move on. And also, like, you're their teachers, which means that you have to grade them. And if it's going to be something that doesn't work and stresses them out, you have to be careful how many times you push it, because your relationship with those students is not one where they're going to patiently try your game 5 million times. So how does that affect the development of classroom games, especially ones that are having like a little bit of a rocky start? How many times do you try it again? Like, what is the playtest life for a game like that? I feel like this is different.
Yeah, so let me give an example of how one of my games developed, and I think it kind of illustrates this point really well. I've got a game, Eyeball to Eyeball, the Cuban Missile Crisis game, and what it started out as is a very kind of linear bipolar Cold War simulation of the Cuban Missile Crisis. You had the Soviets on one side of the room, you had the U.S. on the other, and they kind of played out the steps of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And for me, it was really all about getting them to understand the challenges of decision making under pressure, and how difficult that was, and how hard it is to sit in judgment of leaders who are having to make those decisions, as well as just letting them kind of get a better understanding of the Cold War. Because of course, for my students, the Cold War is ancient history, right? It might as well be Republican Rome. It is ancient history, and they have no sense of the context of it. I was fortunate enough then, after I developed that, to share it with the reacting community. It strictly speaking is not a reacting game, in that at the time it didn't really have primary source documents, and it didn't really have a big clash of ideas, which are two of the big things for reacting. But the reacting community has this great tradition of being very welcoming of kind of role-playing games broadly. And so I was able to share it. And about a year after I shared it, I got a note from an educator at Carroll University, Kimberly Redding, who said, "I love your Cuban Missile Crisis game, but I need you to know how narrow and restrictive it is. I need you to know that it's really not achieving what you think it's achieving, and I want to tell you how I fixed that." And she wrote a bunch of additional Cuban roles and wrote some media roles. And all of a sudden it opened my eyes of, oh, of course. Yes, the Cubans have agency as part of this. Yes, this took place in a global media fishbowl. How could I not think of that? And so she and I have been co-authors on the game ever since, for going on probably 3 or 4 years now. We've iterated a couple different versions of it. It's now very excited. It's now going to be published by Central Michigan Press. So hopefully it'll hit sometime next year, and we're super excited about that. So I think what that speaks to in terms of play testing, and I promise I'm now getting back to your actual question instead of just telling fun stories. What I think that speaks to on play testing is a couple of things. One, you really want to get your game in front of as many different audiences as you can, right? I had a very narrow audience, first year West Point cadets in the core history curriculum. Kimberly used it in an entirely different audience. I think she was actually using it in one of her electives, more senior folks, and that opened up opportunities. That opened up perspectives. So getting it in front of diverse audiences is absolutely critical. The second thing is, your game is not as good as you think it is. And that's really hard for a game designer. Yeah, a little tear running. That's hard for a game designer to hear, because you have bled on this thing. You have sweated on it. You have agonized over the words. And so then to hear somebody say, yeah, but you kind of missed the mark here, boy, that could be so hard to hear. But you've got to be willing to hear it, because your game is not as good as you think it is. And that feedback is going to help you make it better. It's going to help you make it as good of a game as it can possibly be. And then the third piece is have a really clear sense of what your game is and what it isn't, and resist well-meaning suggestions to make it something that it isn't. And I'll just give you an example. For Eyeball to Eyeball, during the Central Michigan review process, we got amazing reviewer feedback on our game. It made it so much better than it had been before. But one of the suggestions dealt with how nuclear war is handled in the game. And there was a suggestion of, well, maybe you should bring in some more nuclear theory and talk about limited nuclear war and talk about deterrence. And we sat back and thought about it and said, I mean, that's fascinating. I mean, as a former Army strategist, I love the idea of, talking nuke theory. But the reality is that the vast majority of classrooms that are going to play this game just aren't interested in that nuance, right? They're just not interested in incorporating that idea. And most faculty members are not going to be equipped to handle that nuance and aren't interested in, reading the 2 or 3 hefty volumes that are really required to do that well. So, we had to say to that suggestion, hey, thanks, appreciate it, but that's not the route we want to go. And so we put in some extra text in the game that said, hey, this game handles nuclear war in a very binary way. I'm not going to spoil the game by talking about how we handle it, but this game handles nuclear war in a very binary way. If you want to introduce more of the nuances, here is potential reading, but you need to understand that the game doesn't really address it. So I think if you're willing to strike that balance between being open to feedback that's going to make it the better game that you want it to be, but also avoiding that, that mission creep, if you will, that, oh, well, I can do this with the game and I can do this with the game. Being willing to balance those two, I think, makes a huge difference as you play test and develop a game.
Interesting. So before I ask you a couple softball questions, just one more. What was your advice for somebody who wants to incorporate more gaming into their classroom, but they don't know how to start? So, I mean, they can call you, but what are, or.
Yeah. I mean, I would be a terrible businessman if my first response to that question wasn't call me, because that's what I do. But I got it. Not everybody is able to do that as a paid service. I totally understand that. The first thing that I would say is take inventory of what are the games in your life that you enjoy and that you're comfortable with, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe that's something as simple as Candy Crush, or maybe you're a lapsed Dungeons and Dragons role-playing gamer and you think about that. But think about the games that make you happy. And then think about, okay, what do I have in terms of learning objectives that might be a good match for this game, that might be a good fit? And another aspect of this is, what are the games that I hear my students talking about? And if you listen, right, if you're kind of keep your ear to the ground in your classroom, you'll hear them talking about different games. And again, digital tabletop role playing, they're all out there, and they're trying different versions of it. And so then once you get that sense of what's their receptivity, what's your receptivity, then you can actually start kind of going out and sniffing for those games that are good fits. And again, be comfortable with the idea of good enough. I would, hey, I would love to find this role-playing game that met all of these learning objectives, but I can only find the one that fits 3 of them. Okay, you know what? I'm going to be okay with good enough on this, and I'm going to run with that in my classroom and tinker with it. And who knows, maybe by doing that, maybe then I find a way to address those 4th or 5th learning objectives.
Nice. So we talked about gaming for education. What are you playing for fun right now?
I am, boy, that is a great question. I just got exposed to a game at this year's Games, Learning, and Society conference, which is now back, and it's now in California. So going out to LA was fantastic. And while I was there, I got exposed to this app called Baba Is You. And I think it actually started as like a console game and then has gone to apps or whatever. But the central conceit of Baba Is You is that you are this little creature, Baba, and you're in this world where the rules of the world are totally defined by little text blocks that you move around and match up. So one of them, for instance, water is death. If you bring those 3 together, then when you touch water, you will die. But if you just move death away from water is, then you can walk through it. And so you have to manipulate these rules in the world in order to achieve this victory condition, which is usually getting this little flag and grabbing the flag and doing a little dance when you get it. And it gets progressively harder. And what I love is how it forces me to challenge my assumptions about the world that I'm living in, right? That it forces me to say, well, okay, yeah, I assumed that hedge was a block, but no, it's not actually defined that way in the world, and I don't have to treat it that way. So I love the underpinning message that I take away, and I don't know if this was intended by the designer or not, but I love the underpinning message, which is don't hold yourself captive to assumptions that are not actually true in your world. Right? Don't let yourself be held back by that. Be willing to push beyond those assumptions. That has been just enormously, enormously fun.
Awesome. And then for those of you who are out there in the world that want to talk to you, Ray, where can we find you online?
Yeah, so my website is 42ED, so the number 4, the number 2 ED .games. I'm very excited to have a .games website. I love that URL extension is out there. So yeah, 42ED.games. And then I'm on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, all as 42EdGames. So you put that term in any one of those, and I'm going to pop right up. And I definitely love having folks reach out to me. If you come to my website, you'll see at the bottom of my website, there's a space to sign up for my newsletter, which is where, if maybe you're not a social media person, but you want to get a sense of the kinds of things that I'm doing or advocating, you'll get a monthly email from me saying, hey, here's the best of what's going on in my world right now that I think you might be interested in as well.
Fantastic. And for those of you out there who are listening, hopefully I can be found anywhere as Beyond Solitaire. Ray, thank you so much for coming on the show and telling us about what you do. What an interesting career path.
Liz, absolutely my pleasure, and thanks for having me. This has been a great conversation.
Everybody out there, please like, subscribe, comment, ask questions, and most of all, happy gaming.